the impact on the sporting value chains and how to implement the SDGs. I can think of no one better to lead this than Giovanni Di Colo of the International Labour Organization. So without further ado, Gianni, I'll hand it straight over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, David. So this is panel number 4, I think. And let me first start by saying that you may note that there is perfect equality here. So we balance a bit of what was missing in the previous panel. And sometimes it's a matter of decision, as Delphine was saying this morning. The reason for this panel is very simple. In the IOC strategy, there is a direct call for workforce, and then there is a call for skills. And you may remember, because I think we have to get back to this issue of youth, it was not completely addressed, to my views. The IOC, the 3 priorities, if I'm not mistaken, of the IOC sustainability strategy are youth, credibility, and sustainability. And I think we have to get back to those issues in this panel. Also, just as an anecdote, when we discussed about the idea of having this panel with Claude STRICKER, who is the executive director of AISTS, everyone knows AISTS, the idea was even to have a ping-pong exchange, Paris 2024 and Sion 2026. But then, for some reasons, Paris 2024, the professor was supposed to come, couldn't come. And so we inherited actually of a situation which is far more balanced, and we have the Council of Europe together with us, Clarisse, BONJEAN. We also have Claude STRICKER, as I was saying, from ICE, University of Lausanne. And then we have Giulia Carbone, who is the Deputy Director of IUCN, which stands for International Union for Conservation of Nature. And the issue that we want to address before you is basically one. Is legacy equal to sustainability? And so the questions that I would like to ask to my panelists are related to those matters. And evidently, it will be from biodiversity perspective, it will be from social sustainability perspective, from the angle of Conseil de l'Europe, and it will be on some of the education perspective, training skills, and also recent experiences, including on Sion 2026 bid, where Claude is having and playing an important role. I just would like, because I don't think we should drop the ball on 2 issues, coordination and measurement. I think we have to be clear here, and I regret that Federico is not here, so eventually I will have to repeat when he comes here. But one issue is coordination. I'm going to tell you an anecdote about coordination to just make sure that we don't confuse coordination and policy coherence. Coordination, if coordination, which is ideal, existed, in the government authorities shouldn't work by sectors. They should work differently. Now, this is not yet happening at the governmental level. So why? And one of the issues that we should ask ourselves, for those who were here before in Makane and all these kind of conferences, before 2000 there was no global agenda. Before 2015 there were no SDGs. So we were working even from the perspective of UN, from a sectorial perspective alone. We were organizing conferences, recommendation of each of the conferences on women, on social aspects of economy and so on population and so on and so forth. And that stopped at the time where MDGs were adopted. Now we are asked to work together on SDGs. And for those who are claiming that we are not measuring, I want to remember that they should look at the SDGs. They should look at the indicators in the SDGs, and then they should perhaps refrain from asking us something that they have a responsibility on. I also want to salute the 2 of my colleagues from the UN. One is Philippe, who was seated here from UNESCO, and the other one is our colleague from WHO. She made a beautiful introduction, and she made a call to all of us. She said, look, I am actually doing something which is a measurement from a health perspective. And I call on your support to come and visit me and send me and then we can come out with this. So to my views, it's a splendid opportunity, but not only that, it's just an example among others. So the fact of saying here, before everyone, this has been on for 14 years, and then the UN agency should only be responsible for measuring, I say, you know, today we are not in 2000, today we are in 2017, the SDGs were adopted, guess what? The IOC adopted this sustainability strategy, so we all have indicators of measurement, we have results, and we all have adopted, because we adopted the SDGs, we have adopted results-based management. So either we stick to this, or we don't talk the same language. The other issue on coordination is that we didn't call this seminar coordination and effectiveness. We talked about coherence of policies and effectiveness. Why? Because we are still having sport as one of the sectors. We have economy, we have health, we have other ministries, okay? So you need to work together with those ministries if you want to get something out of it. So it's better if we focus on policy coherence rather than coordination. By all means, the office was closed, so I don't think we should pleurer sur du lait versé. I don't think this is the issue now. My last point is youth. I am sorry, but we are not addressing the issue of youth. I would like to ask those youth organizations present here at the end of the panel, when we finish the exchange, to please stand up and say what actually you need from us, and how you want this to be done. Because to my views, when we talk about all this, we lose touch with the fact that, you know, I am part of a platform because I represent the ILO in one platform. Then I represent the ILO in another platform. I cannot multiply myself by 10. So my responsibility, and all of you, I'm sure, my responsibility is to make sure that my own colleagues, friends, fellows, students, and so on, they get the same capacity that I have been accumulating in the system for years. And so when I intervened in this, when I was called upon to provide support to the working group, in purpose, I didn't provide support as defending the ILO point of view. I was not interested. My view was, because by all means, I am an ILO official. I know what I value from the ILO. People will see me as an ILO. I stand up for the ILO. The issue is to be serving the others, to be put in a position where you can serve best the needs of the others. And this is what the SDGs are about. And this is what we learned this morning. So let's rephrase a bit some of this. Let's make sure we can focus on skills. We can focus on social sustainability. Please tell us what you think about this. Give us some best practice. I know this exists. And I would like to start with you, Clarisse, because Clarisse has to take a flight at 4 o'clock. She has to leave. So we give her the floor first. And actually, I must say, I'm most glad that we have the participation of Conseil de l'Europe, because the Conseil de l'Europe, like UNESCO, has a mandate on sports. Please, Clarisse.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having, for inviting the Council of Europe. And I apologize for having to leave very soon. The Council of Europe is an intergovernmental organization that has been created in 1949. It is founded on the universal values of human rights, democracy, and the role of law. In the next biennium, 2018-19, links with SDGs will be indicated in the program of activities and budget. But as it was said, it is something we do since the beginning of this organization. The added value of the Council of Europe is a combination of its pan-European membership, 47 member states, its standards, its multi-stakeholder dimension, such as intergovernmental bodies, the Parliamentary Assembly, the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities, the European Court of Human Rights, its monitoring and follow-up bodies and processes, its technical support provided to individual countries, and its global outreach, because most of the organization's legally binding conventions and activities are open to participation by non-member states. Within the Council of Europe, you have different sectors. You have the sports sector. And in general, and also, of course, in the sports sector, the Council of Europe provides 4 types of activities: standard setting, monitoring, international cooperation, and technical assistance to countries. Within the sports sectors, you have the Enlarged Partial Agreement on Sport, EPAS, that gathers 38 states. It works in the framework of a flexible, broad thematic scope and aims at making sport more ethical, more inclusive, and safer. EPAS deals with important issues like good governance, integrity, transparency, and sets up many projects in the area of diversity that are being run in partnership with international sports organizations. We have also in this agreement a consultative committee that gathers some 30 international organizations, and it will set up a working group on gathering evidence on the contribution of sports to SDGs. We are running a lot of activities, a lot of projects. I don't have, unfortunately, time to speak about them today, but I want to say also that we have 4 conventions, very important conventions, because you have the Anti-Doping Convention, you have the Match-Fixing Convention, and also the last one, the Convention on Safety, Security, and Services of Sport Events. All of these conventions are in line with SDGs. But I want to highlight one project that is at the beginning of the process. It is a project on social sustainability of major sport events. The ministers, sport ministers in Europe, were brought together twice in 2014 and 2015 on the issues on promoting a positive legacy of major sport events and on the social sustainability of major sport events. And their conclusions were that social aspects based on the fundamental values of the Council of Europe should be studied in greater detail, that a methodology should be developed, a handbook be produced, and now EPAS is implementing this project. In the first step, the main objective is the publication of a good practice handbook. But in a second step, I hope it is our wish is to work on the evaluation of the aspect of social sustainability of major sport events. And but as I said, it's a very beginning, and we are now identifying good practices. And interlocutors, develop a survey protocol and prepare interviews. And I think then on that basis we will be able to prepare and to publish a handbook with also the other aspects, not only the social aspect, but also in link with the environmental aspect and the economical aspect. I am sorry, but I have to leave now.
It's already? No. I have to ask you a question. With respect, yeah, because I mean, like the ambassador was saying, there is no free lunch. So, The issue is the following. This seminar will allow you to interact at this stage for your handbook and what you are going to propose to the member states of the Council of Europe, for example, with some of the platforms, some of these... Yes? We can expect some of this...
Yes, I would be very, very glad if we can have contact on this matter, on this issue, of course.
Which means that we will provide your email to everyone.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Now you can go, Clarisse.
Yes, I am sorry. Thank you.
Now, this morning, the issue of environment was raised, the issue of climate change was raised, but the issue of biodiversity was not raised yet. So we have the chance to have Giulia will tell us about this. She will also perhaps enhance some of the issues regarding risk management, risk assessment, and some of the exchanges done for the selection of 2024.
Thank you very much. So I work for IUCN, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Business and Biodiversity Program. This is quite telling because it's a program that works with business, and effectively the way we look at sports is like it's a business sector that has impacts and opportunities with biodiversity, and that's how we are approaching this discussion with sports. So yes, we see the entry point for IUCN, which is one of the largest conservation organization membership organization, actually, with 1,300 members. Most of the governments of the countries that you belong to probably here are members of IUCN and NGOs. What is important is that we are a science-based organization that also brings together, over 10,000 scientists in producing knowledge products, such as, for example, the red list that will tell you if a species is vulnerable, endangered, or critical endangered, if an area is protected, or if an area is of a high biodiversity value. The discussion on sports really started as a risk, because actually the question of sports has been put forward to the Secretariat, for which I work, by our members during one of our General Assembly, as a threat to biodiversity. And I'm sorry to come in and talk about risk, because I've seen that a lot of the discussion was really about opportunities about the sport. But effectively, what we need to consider is that behind the sport, most of the time, apart from very few sports, there is an infrastructure that actually has and could have huge risk on the environment, as well as on social issues, as our colleagues were speaking about this morning, on which actually brings me the point about coordination, because there is a lot of platforms looking at human rights and sports, and I'm saying the same issues about license to operate would apply to environment in general and biodiversity specifically. So the issue of risk is very high on the agenda for, from conservation organization looking at sports, especially mega events. And so we had a number of interventions where we have written to the local organizing committees, to the governments, asking for actions to be taken on specific events to mitigate the impacts. Now, on this risk management, so first of all, of course, we talked about due diligence, identify the risk, but once you have identified the risk, well, the next step is actually to manage the risk. In biodiversity, but I suspect also on a lot of human rights issues, including labor issues, the most effective measure is avoidance, because it's the one that will, well, is in some cases either you avoid or there is very little you can restore, or you can remediate, for example, if you're talking about social issues, because some values will be lost forever. And this is very true, for example, the equivalent of, the values of, for example, a World Heritage Site, which could be a natural site or a cultural site, once have been destroyed, there is no replacement for these, because these are universal standing values that are just there and not repeatable somewhere else. So a good mitigation strategy will look first and foremost at avoidance, which will include in some situations changing the location of a site. And I understand that in certain situations this is very challenging from the local organizing committees to say, well, we don't build it here, we build it somewhere else. But in that decision, there is also the element of opportunities, because there are a lot of opportunities for restoration, for example, and again, I'm very focused on environment, but I think also on social element to bring something good. And this is where sports also becomes a force of good in terms of changing the way the legislation or changing the way people see the environment around there as a part of delivering a good sport. So that's part of the mitigation and risk management. The other important element is about skills. These decisions about what is important, and I mean, the decision based on risk and risk assessment and mitigation measures are based on good science, can't just be improvised. And this is where the business sector, especially the large footprint sectors such as mining and oil and gas, have learned their lesson already, and they always cooperate with science-based organizations, being NGOs, universities, but they go to the scientists to get the information. Now, even a further step is to go to independent scientists and make sure that the impact assessment, for example, are independently revised, and that there is the science also collected is independent, because only that is really what it will bring you to a good decision. And sport, being an industry, should really move towards that, especially when there are large infrastructures being built. Really seeking for the science-based decision-making is what was going to make your decision stronger.
I'm going to ask something to Claude, and then I would like to get back to you on the issue of that was discussed. I mean, the practice which I found extremely relevant and positive with the IOC and the candidates to 2024, because that kind of dialogue, I think I would like to everyone to discover it. Claude, is sustainability the same as legacy to you?
Good question. I would look at it this way. For me, sustainability, actually in the framework of sport events, of the organization and the long time, especially for large sport events, to achieve that, to deliver the event, for me, sustainability is more kind of a converging process. And with legacy, you really look at beyond the games, beyond the event. So it's a bit of a different dynamic in terms of mobilizing all the resource, for the organizing committee as well. It's a bit of a different approach. So I think it's important to be aware of that from the early stage of the preparation of the event. And maybe it's different type of people, different type of organization looking for the legacy versus really sticking with all the good sustainability principle in terms of what we just said for the environment and so on. For me, the definition could be, you know, the legacy is all actions in a given area, a given time, after the events, but initiated by structural changes. For instance, a change in the law. If you take Barcelona, for instance, and we talk always about Barcelona 92 as a best case example in terms of legacy, with the infrastructure actually that probably most of you know. An interesting legacy was the change in the country with the law of you know, smoke-free or no smoking area in public space, and actually the games gave the opportunity to for the first time ban smoking in all sport venues. So it's just an example to see that basically you have a structural change with a new law that is put in place, thanks somehow to the event.
What about how do you ensure the trade-off between investment and cost? Because we discussed before, everyone is saying basically a mega sporting event is seen as a cost rather than an investment. To my views, there is something about investing into, for example, into human resources, into training, into skills, into the youth. How do you, where is this trade-off being made? Where is this possible? Because for the moment we know that, you know, cities are dropping out because of a number of the messages apparently is getting across blurred. So do you and of course I do this, I put this question also considering what you are doing as a role of ENGE in the preparation of the Sion 2026 bid.
So with actually, I think Switzerland is really, you know, a country, first a very democratic country. So in such project, you get to be with all the stakeholders and to really have a good common and shared vision about the game. So which means the communes, the cantons, the confederation, the National Sport Association, Swiss Olympic, and the population. And I mean, you cannot take the risk not engaging everyone as much as you can very early in the project, because you know that you have the votation coming up as well. So it's, I mean, it's really in the process, and it can maybe be a bit complicated, but it's really healthy because you have this dialogue, and everyone can have a different opinion, and you take into account all those different stakeholders from the very early start of the project. And it's quite spectacular to see with the Sion 2026 project that in the organizing committee budget, you already have a significant amount that will be for legacy projects. So within the organizing budget, which is quite new because usually it's separated in the non-OCOG budget as an investment, as you say. But in this case, we really want to make sure that from the start, we take very seriously the legacy aspect. And we look at the legacy also from a, we say in French, from a patrimoine point of view, including all educational aspects and social aspects as well.
Very good. So I want to pick up on the issue of dialogue. Can you, Giulia, describe what you did with at the request of the IOC on the candidate cities? I think at the time we were 4 still, before 2 dropped out. So, because I think that is a good example of how we engage really in a dialogue, not only sending reports and critics or whatsoever, but how did it work out?
Well, the story with IOC actually starts from the famous resolution that IUCN passed about, you know, we have to engage with the Olympic Committee and the sports in relation to a number of big sport events that could threaten biodiversity. And I think IOC actually then came to IUCN and asked for advice on specific candidatures, which we provided, especially because we act as advisor to the World Heritage Convention. So in this case, we're specific to World Heritage sites. And then since then, we actually formalized this agreement where IUCN becomes like an independent expert to IOC in looking at during the candidature phase. And I think the great suggestion was that we did this really, sorry, this is not, the idea was to start really from the beginning of the procedure. And so this is the event you're talking about. This was the first workshop that brought together all the different candidate cities. Were 4 at the time, if not, yeah, it was 4. So it was all 4 of them. And where we brought in for each of them the exact, you know, and obviously there is some challenges because you want to provide exactly the same information. And so we also had to learn a lot from our perspective of how the process is carried out, because you have to make sure that there is no favoritism and the information is given in the same way to everybody. But then was an incredible journey because we basically helped them understand where the potential sites that they wanted to build were standing vis-a-vis to key important biodiversity values. So we actually presented maps. You know, and in this venue seems like something very trivial, but well, you probably all have experienced what people feel. Once you put a map in front of them, everybody goes crazy. It's like, oh, this is where we are. And, you know, you start looking at things and everybody start realizing the opportunities and risk. I mean, some of them, they had already identified them in the first candidatures. But that phase, that exercise, that dialogue was really a great opportunity also for them to understand that there are organizations out there with a lot of knowledge that could help them if they were selected to go forward. And that was a bit the ultimate aim. So to give them something right there, give them an appetite for learn more about your site. There's some very good information out there and there is more you can gather. And then the next step was for us to review all the candidature files, actually the first and the third step, where there are elements related to biodiversity, and we produced a report for the IUCN, which they use themselves in their report to the candidate cities.
Which drives me to a question to myself: why we shouldn't do this on issues of labor and instead of sending reports to each other, which actually sometimes is more complicated to assess. And I think John as an example to give you on Tokyo 2020, which is very recent as well. My last question, a very short one for Claude, and then I would like to pick up 3 questions. Is okay, David? One has to come from that direction anyway, so I will, if it doesn't come, I'll pick it up. But I would like to ask you, I was struck by the reaction of the HES, those haute école, for example, in the Valais, etc., which picked up the issue immediately of sport tourism or mountaineering, conservation, and so on. Can you give an insight on this? Because you said, you know, that's a participatory process and so on. But what prompted their reaction so positive?
I mean, it's a bit specific to Switzerland, but one of the first, hopefully, benefit of hosting the games will be to use the games as a platform to develop, accelerate the transition, especially with the mountain areas and all the challenge now with the warming. You need to find what will be the next economy for this mountain area, which are a good part of Switzerland. So it makes sense within the context of organizing, hosting the games to have projects in this area. So of course, if you invite the people from those areas to express their needs or from the schools actually from these areas, they are very quick to have projects and ideas, and that's what we did. We did already over 10 workshops on different topics with these people to get a first idea of what could be the project. But the next steps is to go with the confederation and the cantons to make sure that everything is aligned with the strategy of those different authorities. And then it's a process, it's a journey, but what is spectacular is we are 9 years, if Switzerland organized the game, we are 9 years in advance. So, you know, it's a bit the Swiss way. You have already to have maps also, as well as you said. I'm sure biodiversity will certainly be a big topic, because in Switzerland we also have this issue. What is important, it's the organizing committee is really believing in it, and I think it's the case in Switzerland. But now I get a bit biased and try to say the thing, but
thanks, Claude.
How we did.
And Giulia, 3 questions. One down there, as I told you, yes, announced before.
Hello once again, everyone. I'm Nenad from ENGZE Youth, and I would like to follow on the actions that we have this amazing opportunity to talk with each other and to take some concrete actions. And as ENGZE Youth is representing youth over here, and we are talking about employability in terms of how to contribute to sustainable development goals through employability of youth. I would like to share with everyone that ENGZE Youth was part of the study on contribution of sport to the employability of young people. And on top of that, we would like to keep working in this direction, how to raise employability of youth in Europe. Therefore, Mr. Giovanni Di Cola, I would like to ask you for concrete cooperations. Would you like to, as an International Labour Organization, would you like to keep working in this direction with ENGZE Youth? And not only you, but also everyone who is here and willing to contribute to employability of youth voice in sport. Thank you.
Good. So I'm going to ask back to some of the floor down there. For example, some federations who would join us in doing this. And then I would like to ask to Philippe from UNESCO if that could be part of one of the action programs under Kazan, evidently, because he indicated that Kazan is an action-oriented plan, so I would seek support from UNESCO as well. The support of the ILO is already there. Is there any other federation among those present here that is able to join this? Because without a sport federation, it doesn't make any sense. Please. Mike. Mike has been stolen by UNEP. So UNEP is going to join anyway. So.
Good afternoon, Romain Fermont from the International School Sport Federation. I just would like to
acknowledge the proposition of my colleagues from the youth voice, and the youth. I think talking about youth, even if the International School Sports Federation is not a youth organization, but we represent directly the interest, and our action are actually in the direction of young people from school between 13 and 18 years old. So definitely this kind of invitation, we want to jump in to contribute and to have impact, of course, in our sector. And I believe that other organizations, I mean, all sport federations are in contact with the youth at some point, since young people are doing sport around the world. But there are also some organizations, I'm thinking directly about the FISU, the International University Sport Federation, collaborating with the higher education sector and directly in charge of having impact through sport for young people doing studies over 18 years old and so on and so forth. So yeah, definitely I think we are definitely in with the youth. I cannot talk on the name of FISU, but I'm sure that there is a field of cooperation here. And somehow it should also gather maybe some other federation who have in their strategy the same objective, and external actors which could support from the ILO is an excellent initiative from the labor market. We had other stakeholders who could join definitely this initiative. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Philippe.
Thank you. Now my chance to pitch UNESCO in terms of youth as well. I didn't want to take that pitch away from UNICEF in our podium discussion. Youth is addressed in the Kazan Action Plan already. First, as a main stakeholder related to a number of the SDGs, the 8 SDGs we have identified being the priority SDGs, but also in what I would call the first main policy area, which is the bottom line policy area. And specific policy area 1.6 deals with participation of youth in decision-making at all levels. So it's very clear that the sustainability of sport policy is depending on the involvement of youth in the decision-making. And so we are really expecting to work with ENSCO and other stakeholders to inform that policy area, again, through norms, through good practice, through indicators, etc. So it's a core part of the follow-up to the Kazan Action Plan. It does not need to be included, it is already there.
Okay, good, perfect. FISU is not around, right? No. Yes? No. Anyone else? Other questions? So we know what to do with respect to the youth. We are going to support the youth organization with respect to what they want to do on employability skills and in and through sport. And then ISF will start, ENSO Youth is there, ILO will support, and then we will seek advice and guidance from UNESCO because it's part of what we have to do with respect to implementing Kazan. And then if IOC doesn't come, it means that there is something wrong, but IOC will be there, I'm sure. And then yes, UNEP, Wandi. That's last question.
Thank you very much. It's not a question, actually. It's just a comment on the part of measurements.
Yes, please.
And I think most people, it seems, maybe I'm just imagining, it seems most people are not aware of what is happening at the national level in terms of what is called the National Voluntary Reporting on the New Development Agenda. And also in July, there were 44 countries who actually submitted their intentions in terms of how they want to implement this new development agenda. I think people need to look that up a little bit because there's so much information. Beyond just talking about the SDGs, there are specific targets, 169, 234 specific indicators which are worked together with the UN agencies but also with member states. So I think it's important people look at that. The second one, which I got a little bit worried, is when people said they don't really understand what these SDGs are. Maybe we need to change the narrative a little bit because we are talking about a lasting legacy for sustainable development. That's higher place that we all want to go. Then we need to talk about the issues. What are the issues? And instead of saying SDG 1, SDG 2, what are the actual issues? I give you a good example. Switzerland, for example. The 17 SDGs are packed into, even, I can't believe I said SDGs. The 17 goals are packed into 9 specific priorities. For example, social security. How does that fit into the Sustainable Development Goals? This is a focus on Goal 1 and 16. Question we need to ask is, how do we see sport, how can sport advance social security? How does sport advance natural resource management? So I think as we walk out of this place, probably for my Swiss colleagues, look at the intention that has been put since 2016. And next year, 2018, Switzerland is going to present the full report, how Switzerland is going to implement this agenda. So it exists, to how we can measure it. So look at it. Last but not least, this agenda is about what we call the 5 Ps. This is about people, you and me. This is about the planet. This is about peace. This is about prosperity. And finally, this is about partnership, working together. So maybe we need to do a bit of homework, how we can also share this information that already exists here.
Good. Yeah, it's Claude, one last word, fine?
I'm just saying that I totally agree with what was just said here. And I mean, in another perspective, but if you have to talk to the population and start talking about SDG number 5 and SDG number 8, that's not what you will use, right?
Okay, I think we have to close. Thank you so much to everyone, Claude, Giulia, and Clarisse.
And Giovanni, thank you to you too for stirring the pot a bit. Thank you very much indeed for that. And I would just add, as a BBC presenter, as we do a swap actually, if we can get the next panel straight up, that would be great. Makane, wherever you are, Professor, and the speakers. Yeah, as a BBC presenter, I can promise you SDGs are never mentioned because we'd have to explain it. Isn't that a problem though? So looking for simpler ways of getting the message out is critically important, and it's fine for you in here if you all understand SDGs. It's of absolutely no use to anyone beyond that particular scope, so please bear that in mind. Okay, we're going to move swiftly on to our 5th panel session. As you know, and you'll see from the agenda, it's our last panel session. It will be followed immediately by a brief, pithy assessment from each of our facilitators on what the messages are to be drawn out of today. But to get there, we have to navigate this session. Let me just take you through it. Implementing policies and working with the UN through public and private partnerships, something that's been touched on. Now we get a chance to look at it in more detail. And just as Professor Makane, are you there? I think you're with us, which is great. Okay. Well, Makane MBENGE is from the University of Geneva. I'm very pleased to say that he is going to marshal us through this particular panel session, so I'll leave it in your hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to be here. As David mentioned, my name is Makane MBENGE. I'm a professor of international law at the University of Geneva, and I will have the pleasure to facilitate panel number 5 on implementing policies and public-private partnerships. I would like to say that I'm not typically somebody who's coming from sports. I've been working in sustainable development issues for the last 20 years, and sports was never something that has popped up in my research. And I think the reason is very simple, is that when it comes at least to the international law of sustainable development, because I've been looking at sustainable development from the international law perspective, there's no discussion at all about sports, because the instruments most of the soft law instruments that have been governing sustainable development for the last 20 years do not refer to sports. Let's think about the Rio Declaration of 1992, which was the main instrument that has launched the Sustainable Development Agenda. Rio speaks about the need of having a new global partnership, new levels of cooperation between states, key sectors of society, the people. When you check Agenda 21, no reference at all to sports. Even Rio plus 20, so 20 years after Rio, in 2012, the international community adopted a report called The Future We Want, in which they were insisting on the need of new partnerships. And for the first time, they emphasized the need of public-private partnership. It was clear in the Rio plus 20 outcome document that public-private partnerships are needed, that the international community is for it. When you check the document, no mention at all to sports. And I have to say that when Professor Badley asked me to act as a facilitator in the panel, my first reaction when I received the email was like, this is a great topic, but what? I've never heard about it. And I started to do research as a good academic. I started to do research, and actually I realized that there's a broad area of soft law instruments that have been put in place by sports institutions, by sports organizations, that is showing that actually there is an area of law that is evolving, that is emerging, and that is connecting sustainable development and sports. So this is something very interesting for an international lawyer like me. I think it's also very important for the University of Geneva. I have to say that we've been very much involved in sports, mainly because of our former vice-rector, Professor Badley. I have to pay tribute to her for that. And of course, this is something we think we want to explore more. We want to strengthen more this link between SDGs and sports. And of course, public-private partnerships are very important for that. So to discuss this very important topic, I have a great panel. I have very interesting speakers here coming from different fields. And I think this will make the panel very interesting, because this panel is going to focus mostly on field experience. So it's good to have different field experience from different people with different profiles. I will maybe deviate a bit from the earlier practice that consisted in presenting all the speakers. I would prefer to present each of them so everybody can really know what they're doing before their speech. So I will not present you all right now. I will start with our first speaker, Mr. Oliver Dutfield. Oliver is the head of the Department of Sport for Development and Peace at the Commonwealth Secretariat. I think that Oliver is a very interesting person, because actually he's been doing this almost all his career. I don't know how long you've been into that, but he's been for a long, long time developing cooperation with UN institutions, other institutions with respect to sports, and the linkage with SDGs recently. But the idea of sport for peace and development has been already here in your work. So we're very much looking forward to listen to you, because the Commonwealth Secretariat is one of the very rare interstate organizations that has developed a unique and particular framework to connect SDGs and sports. So without further ado, Oliver, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the organisers for the invitation. So in the last session, and you're going from the lawyer to the civil servant to talk about public-private partnerships. Probably not the dinner party you want to be at, but unfortunately, you can't leave at this point. So I'm just going to do three things. One, seeing as we're talking about public-private partnerships, I'm going to share a quote from the most well-published economist, academic economist. Number two, I'm going to ask a question, and then drawing back on my comfort as an international civil servant and a quasi-bureaucrat, I will then present of course, strategic framework for partnership or collaborative implementation of maximising sport and sustainable development. So I only have to sit through 3 areas that I will present to you. So the first, the quote, "If technology is with us." There we are. Strategic partnerships. The essence of strategy is choosing what not to do, from Professor Michael Porter. Now, I spoke at a round table yesterday, and the quote I used to start was Pierre Bourdieu. So it might go from one side of an economic lens or worldview to another one now, if you're familiar with either of their work. But nevertheless, the essence of strategy is choosing what not to do. So I'm going to ask you to keep that in mind as we go through. And you might see a few extra slides, so we might have a couple more than 3 things. The 3 major components. There's the quote. Now, that's driven our analysis of maximising the contribution of sport to sustainable development, with the caveat that clearly the critical component of the SDGs is the interlink of economic, social and environmental sustainability. It's been emphasised significantly. But we felt, aligned with and our support for the Kazan Action Plan process, identifying specific components of this agenda where the evidence base and theories of change indicate sport can contribute most significantly. Not just at goal level. Underneath the 8 goals of the Kazan Action Plan, of which some of our analysis supported, there's 38 specific targets identified to give that policy guidance. But I think we've had that conversation today. But of course, there's a policy framework and a policy norm for undertaking that analysis and that strategic approach of making choices. Spreading sport across all goals and targets will not have the impact of a measured, targeted approach. There's also a policy framework in the 2030 Agenda for public-private partnerships. Target 17.7, which fits in a suite of targets around implementation, essentially around mobilising resource and mobilising resource from non-traditional means for development cooperation and development outcomes. But like with sports mentioned in the 2030 Agenda, the mentions of public-private partnerships are not many. So let's analyse this a bit further. Private sector mentions, and you can see the data there around the references to private sector in 2 key policy frameworks. One, the 2030 Agenda, but as we're talking about a financing issue, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which looked at financing sustainable development. So you can see the numbers there of actual references. The second analysis or chart there is specific or distinct references. So if private sector was spoken 3 times on a particular area, that's only 1. And then the different goals, or for the Addis Action Agenda, the different action agendas. So you've got 2 of the 17 SDGs specifically talk to private sector, and you've got 5 of the 7 action points from the Addis Agenda. Now, if we break that down to public-private partnerships, we go down even further. You've got 2 of 260 distinct parts of the 2030 Agenda which speak to public-private partnerships, 6 in the Addis Action Agenda. The distinct references are 2 each, and then we break down to 1 goal in the SDGs and 2 of the actions. So the actual lens for this is quite small across these policy agendas. If we go to sport, there's the same analysis for the Kazan Action Plan, and also just as another policy framework or plan, the Agenda 2030. You can see private sector references, distinct references, and the goals or action it features in. So if we break that then down to public-private partnerships, that's not a technological malfunction, that's the numbers.
Wow.
There's zeros there for those at the back of the room. So we have a bit of a vacuum in terms of the policy reference point for this discussion. So let's find some definitions. And no one likes a PowerPoint, particularly at the last session of the day, so I won't read that to you, but there's two areas I'll highlight. One, shared risk. Two, that in a public-private partnership, you go above what would be expected in a usual contract, a usual sponsor agreement, and I think we come back to the risk. Now, of course, when these definitions are defined, typically the risk is talking about financial risk, but I want to take that further for the context of this discussion. The risk that we've been identifying all day around human rights risks, and also the risk that the economic component of sustainable development can outweigh the environmental and the social. So as the public side of the actors in PPPs, that risk we must be alive to. But it brings us back to this question, the second point, the question I wanted to ask. If we can take this assumption that we're talking here about what risk is the private sector prepared to invest in? Because we're talking different and above and beyond the usual contract. What risks, within the context of the Sustainable Development Agenda, are the private sector prepared to invest in? Where will they take on risk to deliver on what might be considered public sector outcomes? I'll let you ponder that for a moment. Now, there's one bit of evidence when we think about what risk business will take on. Unfortunately, about half of business still think this is a government's agenda only. But the good news is there's at least 50% of the business world who are looking more broadly and particularly seeing the Sustainable Development Goals as an opportunity. One of those is the Sustainable Business Commission, and as part of answering this question, I wanted to share their report, Better Business, Better World. And they see the SDGs as being a US $12 trillion opportunity for business. And they're saying business needs the SDGs, and of course, as the AISTS Action Agenda said, the SDGs need business. Now, let's go back one step. We said the essence of strategy is choosing what not to do, and the private sector have done that. And one example is here. They've identified 60 of the biggest market opportunities on the Sustainable Development Agenda. So our question as sport, when we're looking at our strategy around public-private partnerships, are we looking at the areas where business are prepared to take a risk because they see market opportunity? Are we also then considering the risk in terms of human rights, in terms of social policy, in terms of environmental policy of that economic investment? And probably can't see that, but you can reference the report. But also they've looked at 5 types of business models. So that idea of strategy being about choosing what not to do, in that example, the private sector have said this is what we will and will not invest in, this is what we see as the opportunities in this sector. So we come to point 3 I wanted to make. And that is, what's the implications for policy implementation? The question we're addressing here. I'll go back to my civil servant, bureaucrat hat, and share with you a framework. Now, this is very small print. What I wanted to point out is this is a policy implementation framework that's part of our analysis of maximising the contribution of sport to the SDGs. And what it says is, as public policy makers, there's essentially 4 types of policy or organisation of that policy to maximise the contribution of sport to sustainable development. The top is basically government-led. You can see the nice infographic. The bottom is autonomous. But in the middle, there's a policy type which talks to structured implementation partnerships, including PPP. So the practical tool is whether your public authority as a policymaker or even a sports organisation is the opportunity to map your policies based on making that decision, that strategic approach of choosing what not to do. Some policies will be primarily implemented by the public authority or the sporting organisation, but others, those middle 2 streams, become a space for PPPs, but a very strategic space. An example, of a sporting organisation. Now, I work with governments, civil service. The Commonwealth Games Federation, a separate entity, have set up a special vehicle called Commonwealth Partnerships, which is with Lagarde Sports, a private sector entity, about maximising the economic and all other return from the rights to hosting the Commonwealth Games. Needed a special vehicle to set that up, needed a legal entity to set that up to be able to maximise the public-private partnership based on mapping the policy objectives across that framework. So to conclude, there's one last point. There's a fourth P which I wanted to leave us with. And that was, of course, in these arrangements, there's the issue of profit. And that's where we come back to the point of risk and the critical importance of ensuring that the PPP models, or the strategic frameworks of PPPs, are not only guided by the one aspect of sustainable development, the economic component, but critically the social and environmental components and the accepted frameworks, be they the UN guiding principles, be they international label standards, be they social policy or environmental policy standards, ensure that the risk of that fourth P does not become too much of a trade-off to the social and environmental return that we are after. So 3 points I wanted to make: share a quote, ask you a question, and of course, as a civil servant bureaucrat, share a framework. And I will rest there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Oliver. I think that he has added another P to the to the SDGs profit.
A risk fee.
A risk profit. Thank you very much, Oliver. So now it is my great pleasure to welcome to our panel Mrs. Maria Valles. Maria is the General Director of the Football Club Barcelona Foundation. I think it's very great that we could have somebody from a football club. I see that some people are asking already for some shirts. So it's very good to have you with us, Maria. I can't go in detail with respect to Maria's experience, but she has a tremendous experience working for non-profit organizations in the field of development, humanitarian aspects. You've been everywhere, and in particular in Africa, Latin America. So it's really good also to see that we can go from purely development, humanitarian perspective to the sports approach. So it means that there are bridges actually between the two, and we'll have the chance to hear from our other colleagues afterwards. So Maria is going to share with us a field experience regarding public-private partnerships that have been put in place by the FCB Foundation with UN and other actors. So Maria, you have the floor. Thank you
very much, and it's really a pleasure to be here today among all of you. Our interest as the club and the foundation, we really believe that we can improve and explode our impact working in partnerships, and this is really important for us. First, I would like to start explaining to you that the club, since 2010, joined the Global Compact. That means that the club is supporting the job of the foundation, supporting it in a very specific way, with 0.7% of the income of the club goes directly to the foundation. And it's not only the club, it's also the players. Yeah? The players are giving 1% of their income to the foundation. This is a model that is really inside the ADN of the club. I don't know if you're aware that the club is owned by 150,000 members. It's not owned by any millionaire and so on. It has a very democratic model on the way of taking decisions, and this changed a lot, no? The nature of the club. And so before, when you were talking, no, there was a very interesting debate about if sports is really contributing to the agenda, international agenda. I would say that in our case, this has come bottom up, because the democratic model that we have And the people were asking for that, the people who own the club. And then for me, more than saying if a sports industry or the sports in a very generic way is contributing to change and improve the world, I would say that what is contributing to change the world are specific, committed institutions. And I think this is important for the debate because we need to finger, no? And of course, governing bodies can help a lot to push the sport industry to, as well as civil initiative can push for sports industry to contribute to that. Well, saying said that, also just to let you know that the foundation has 3 main strategic lines, that this was defined in a new strategic plan 1.5 years, more or less. The first strategic line is prevention of violence and resolution of conflict. The second one is social inclusion. The third one is education. All our programs, all the programs that we do, fall under these 3 strategic lines, and we are scoping a specific 5 SDGs through the different programs that we fall under these strategic lines. Our strategy to operate at all levels is with partnerships. Yeah? We have our own methodologies, and this is also important to know. Also before, somebody was saying that the sports has to be together with quality, otherwise maybe you reject some people from practicing sports. And this is what we try to apply from the excellence in the sport and education in values. And this is also in the ADN of the club. For us, it's very important to combine both things in order to have effective methodologies that have an impact in the life of many children and young people. So, going back to the partnerships, we do things with a lot of partners. We have our traditional partnership with UNICEF for more than over 10 years. We have started also a new partnership with UNHCR. Here, Karen, we'll talk later. We have a partnership also with IOC since more than 5 years. We are present in more than 20 countries in Africa. We are building a new partnership with the Paralympics Committee and their foundation. But I just wanted to explain to you 2 specific partnerships and how this has changed and how do we work with them. At the level of UNICEF, we are working together and with a new focus, and we have been working for more than a year. So partnerships are not easy. I think that you need to be flexible, you need to reinvent yourself, you need to revise which are your goals, you need to establish a clear governance of the partnership so it can work. We have been, and we are at different levels, at the level of programming, at the level of advocacy and campaigning with UNICEF as well, and at the level of generation of knowledge. Valerio mentioned before, we are launching, along with UNICEF and their Innocenti Research Center, a new research to find evidence base on sports for development in order to harvest the sports for development impact. And this is, we believe is going to be a very important exercise. Also, another different partnership that we have been working in Colombia for a while, has nothing to do with UN, but I think there are public actors there, and I think it's important that you can see how this has had some effects. The City Hall of Cali is a context affected by the peace process, the displacement also of many people. You have a context of violence. The City Hall of Cali has had different sports initiatives, so they asked us to intervene there. And last year, after 3 years of working together, we sit down together to share experience. And from this sharing experience, there are new initiatives coming up. So we took the time, we share those experiences. There are new initiatives coming up. We will give them some training with our specific methodologies, but including the young people of the area, we have been able to innovate in different sports, not the traditional sports like football. Most of our programs are based in football because it's something that people demand. But for instance, because Cali is a very urban context, some of the sports that were identified by the young people that they had interest were skating, for instance. So we are applying our new methodologies in the sports that are really prevalent and are of interest. And this is a way to innovate as well. So working with partnerships can have really an impact on innovation, of moving forward, of having a broader impact. But of course, as I said before, you need flexibility, you need time, you need clear goals, you need to have identified very well which are the strengths of each of the partners who are there, and you need patience as well.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good to see that public-private partnerships can be the DNA of a football club, to quote one word that you use in your presentation. So now it is my pleasure again to introduce Mrs. Karen Whiting, who's the Senior Advisor of Child Protection and Youth at the UNHCR Division for International Protection, if I'm not mistaken. So Karen is going to tell us about how sports can be used for humanitarian outcomes and how those humanitarian outcomes can be determined or identified via public-private partnerships. Even if I've understood that maybe the word public-private partnership is not necessarily your day-to-day vocabulary, but it's going to be interesting to see the perspective of the UNHCR. So you have the floor, Karen. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So for those of you who aren't familiar with UNHCR, we are mandated to protect and assist refugees and to work with states to find solutions to their problems. We also, over the years, have seen our mandate extended. So we also work with stateless people. That's people for whom no state recognizes them as citizens. And we also work with, in certain circumstances, internally displaced persons. So people who have been forcibly displaced for some of the very same reasons as refugees, but they haven't crossed an international border. Why is UNHCR, who you think of as a sort of humanitarian life-saving agency, on a panel about the SDGs? Well, part of the SDGs vision, as you know, is to ensure that no one is left behind. And so it's also important that refugees, IDPs, and stateless people aren't left behind and are also able to benefit from the programs and the outcomes linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. So we work with over 65 million forcibly displaced people around the world. That includes 22.5 million refugees. And of those refugees, 51% of them are under 18 years of age. It's 51% of all refugees globally are children. That's compared to 31% in the global population. Why do I mention children in particular? Because this is the way that UNHCR has come to work on sports. As you know, in many circumstances, even if children have been displaced across a border, have been separated from their families, have experienced the stress and anxiety of displacement, they still find ways to play games and sports, either by using makeshift improvised balls. One of the photos at the bottom there is of a soccer ball made out of tied together plastic bags, but also improvised soccer fields, football pitches, and other things. So initially, a lot of the activities were informal, but increasingly became much more organized. So starting off with things like soccer or football, depending upon where you come from, basketball, volleyball, but increasingly looking to different types of sports. We've increasingly recognized that sports is an effective way to reach protection outcomes. So in addition to the physical benefits and the sort of mental health benefits of sports, also sports is an effective mechanism or a tool to talk to children, adolescents, and young people about protection. Oftentimes, lectures about human rights and about international protection aren't particularly interesting to children, young people, and adolescents. But if you can incorporate those kinds of learning opportunities into sports and games, you're much more effective in getting the point across. So what are some of these protection outcomes that we are able to achieve through sports programs? So learning and capacity building, a lot of the panelists over today have spoken about the opportunity for education, not only formal, but also informal and life skills through sports. It's also an awareness-raising tool, so we can use sports activities to speak to children and young people about protection risks and how to protect themselves, how to build up their own self-protection mechanisms, and also their resilience. It's also a tool to convene people, to bring people together. So that means that it can also be a peace-building tool. Oftentimes, when you have large-scale forced displacement, there can be tension between the displaced population and the hosting population. Oftentimes, sport is a good way to bring those communities together and get them to understand their common challenges, but also the things that they share together. We also see that sports is an effective tool for advocacy, so changing people's perceptions about refugees, IDPs, and stateless people. They're not just people that you see on television in the Mediterranean, but they're people who live with you and who used to live just like you did. And then finally, it's also a very great fundraising tool. So who do we work with in order to do this? Because indeed, UNHCR has a lot of experience on how to set up tents and camps, but not necessarily how to implement sports programs. So we work together with a broad range of international federations and different civil society actors, even religious organizations, in order to put in place these sports for protection programs. So you have there a photograph of our High Commissioner with the Olympic torch from the one of the Olympic torches, sorry, from the 2016 Olympics. And there I would also like to just briefly talk about something that I think many of you know about, which is the Refugee Olympic team. I won't spend too much time on it because I understand Erin will also speak to you a little bit about it. But in terms of advocacy and about changing perceptions about refugees, this was a really positive experience for UNHCR. So people saw refugees as people with skills, with capacities, as agents, people with their own agency. So that wouldn't have been possible without the strong partnership between the IOC and UNHCR and a shared commitment to working on refugee issues and to changing perceptions about refugees. So something that we wouldn't have been able to achieve on our own, but that when working in partnership, we were able to do. What is sports for protection? It's an approach that we're using to look at how we can better use sports in order to achieve these protection outcomes. So at present, we're working together with the International Olympic Committee and Terre des Hommes on a sports for protection toolkit. Why another toolkit? Why another manual? Because in humanitarian contexts, which are a little bit different than development contexts, that expertise on how to develop programs and how to measure the impact and the outcome of those programs, so impact and outcome, something that we again have spoken about a lot today. So we're looking at how to formalize that. We've consulted with over 100 practitioners on what they would want from a sports for protection toolkit. We've also consulted with over 700 young refugees and forcibly displaced people to understand what are some of the risks that they identify as the most most sort of serious, but also what kinds of sports programs they want and how they want UN agencies and civil society actors and private entities to work with them. So we're working together, as I said, with the IOC and Terre des Hommes to develop this toolkit. And then we also have a number of partners who are working with us on a consultative group, so including War Child, Peace Players, Right to Play, Fight for Peace, Mercy Corps, and UNICEF. So really a wide range of stakeholders with different expertise. So we're hoping that this will help us to better plan and program for sports programs in humanitarian context, but also to better measure the impact of our interventions. That's something that we look forward to working on in the next, or releasing in the next little while. I also wanted to speak briefly about some of the sports for protection projects that we're working on. Together with the International Olympic Committee, we've been working together on sports for protection programs, and we will continue to do so in order to pilot this sports for protection toolkit. So I wanted to speak briefly about 3 countries, if I have time. First, we have implemented a sports for protection program together with the IOC in Colombia. There we worked with internally displaced populations through a number of different types of sports, including soccer, but also sort of traditional sports to help children and young people work through some of the stress and anxiety associated with being forcibly displaced and separated from their families, but also to help them identify with their cultural heritage. The other element of the project was also to work with communities and families to help those children and young people be in a protective environment. So working together with the community, with parents, with the broader community to understand the importance of protection, but also how we can use sports and sports facilities to create that protective environment. Another project that we've worked on is in Rwanda, where we have again worked with football. Again, it is a very popular sport, but also other sports such as basketball and volleyball, but also, again, traditional games and dances as well, to work with children and youth in refugee camps to help them identify some of the protection risks, but also how to protect themselves. Again, there was another important component of working with families and communities to understand the protection risks that people face, but again, using the tool or the mechanism of sport and dance and games to make it a little bit more fun. And then finally, in Mexico, we're again working with the IOC. This is a project that's still in development, so the sports are still to be determined, although undoubtedly it will probably be football yet again, given the popularity of football there. But there we're looking to see how to work with young people who have been displaced from the northern triangle of Central America, so the states of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, where a number of young people are fleeing extreme gang violence. And they're now in Mexico as a country of asylum, and there the project aims to help these young people fit into their new environment, but also to help them integrate with the host community. Again, this issue of social cohesion and using sports and play as a tool to help people come together and meet, identify their commonalities, and then work together on issues that are common to both of them. Other projects that are in the pipeline are in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and in Italy. So those will be 2 locations where, again, we'll be piloting this Sports for Protection toolkit.
Maybe we can keep some of the other partnerships for the discussion? Or?
Sure, I'm going to finish, I promise.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
I'm a lawyer, I'm very good at negotiating, you see. And then I just wanted to mention briefly the partnership that we have with the Football Club Barcelona Foundation. Again, 2 components of that partnership, one on campaigning to get people to to use the large fan base of FCB to sign on to our With Refugees campaign to get them to change perceptions about refugees, but also an operational component on sports projects. And then just one last point on how we work also with refugees themselves. We are also working with young refugees, refugees generally from 15 to 24 years of age, to develop, implement, and monitor their own sports programs. We do that through something called the Youth Initiative Fund. So we work with sometimes even registered NGOs of refugee youth to implement these types of projects. So these projects, again, have as their objective, protection objective, so working on integration of girls into sports or integration of LGBTI youth into communities, but using, again, a sports methodology in order to do so. So through all of this, I think some of the things that we'd like to continue to focus on are, again, building this evidence base. And I think, again, the work that we do with FCB, but also with the IOC, will help us to do that, but also to expand those partnerships and perhaps to benefit from a lot of the expertise that is in this room here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation. I think that you have paved the way now for Erin's presentation. So Erin HAYBA is working at the University of Geneva. She's the head of a program for education in refugee camps in Africa called InZone. It's a University of Geneva program that is focusing on higher education in refugee camps. She will tell us more about it, and I think it brings a good connection between the two presentations. So last but not least, Erin, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have the unique and difficult opportunity of being the very last speaker of a long day, and I hope that you'll find it interesting and that also something to take away and not to repeat all the many wonderful things that were said today. So I'm going to focus on education together with sport and the multitude of SDGs that can work towards achieving, but particularly focus on the humanitarian side and working with refugees. So you must be wondering, what is InZone and why am I here? I'm here also on behalf of the director of InZone, Dr. Barbara Moser-Mercer, who is traveling and ensuring our programs are working right now in the Middle East. But we also operate in East Africa, particularly in Kenya. And we work to provide an online blended learning for refugees using resources from the University of Geneva, but many other universities to reach these refugees. And you've heard about the numbers of refugees, but when you talk about higher education, less than 1% of refugee youth have access to higher education. And the earlier discussion about measuring sports participation, I think that's something that we need to think about too when we look about education and sports. How can we measure this achievement? So our courses look at things like teaching about human rights, about ethics, history, engineering, health, and we're also working on a program to do a degree in international relations, and among many different things. And we are now really exploring the opportunity to include sports into the curriculum of courses that we do offer. And we work with a whole lot of partners in order to do this. As you know, a university is not a traditional humanitarian actor. Maybe it's called upon for research, but in terms of actually implementing programs on the ground, no. We're very new at that. So we need to rely on the partners to enable to do that. I mean, we are partnered with UNHCR and the education unit there, but we also work with local governments and local universities, but also big foundations or smaller foundations to fund us, such as we are sponsored by the Swiss Agency for Development, and the Ford Foundation, Open Society, and HP, just to name a few. Now, bringing all these actors together, I missed a few. We work with technology companies that help us operate and provide the online resources or the online platforms for education. And yeah, and there's a couple more. So that's a real challenge. And I think the reason I highlight that is because I think when I think about sports, you have to think about how do we bring all those actors together, and I've heard a lot of talk about how do we coordinate. The last thing that the university has just really gotten rolling on is we co-lead with UNHCR a consortium of universities and similar actors that's called the Connected Learning and Crisis Consortium. And this year we focused on developing a set of standards and guidelines in order to operate in these places. And as the refugee crisis continues to grow, more and more universities across Europe, North America, and Africa are coming up and saying, we want to be a part of this. We want to, as a university, we have a responsibility. And I was talking to our former rector of the university, and he's like, you know, as a public university in Switzerland, I have to go back and tell, you know, why is this good for the University of Geneva to do this? It's good for our professors, it's good for our students, I mean, in terms of how to run our classes and what the students can gain out of it. The University of Geneva students that take courses that the refugee students are taking are connected and can learn from one another. But it also improves the system in terms of how the university can be inclusive of people that are very difficult to reach. So I'll come back to that point around multiple partners on a project. So InZone sees higher education as bringing critical thinking and problem solving and knowledge to empower refugees to be leaders in their communities and to bring peace. And I see sport being integral into that process. And that refugees can use what they learn to bring back to their, whether it's the camps, their home countries, or wherever they're resettled. And that when you talk about higher education space, sports can play a role in that, in bringing students and communities together, where students can bring what they've learned in class to the playing field. I've heard today about a lot of different opportunities in order to bring change, and I see 3 particular entry points between sport and education. And maybe you can add some more to this. But the 3 that I see, the first one is having sports programs where there's education facilities. You know, if there's schools having the ability to play a sport after school or even during school and physical education. The second one is at the vocational level, looking at what skill sets are needed in order to use sports to have sports programs. And this could be anybody that might not have ever gone to school but wants the opportunity to learn. And I think that's it's an informal way of going about it. And the last, of course, is the University of Geneva. I'll talk about higher education, looking at what skills and knowledge that we can bring at a higher level. And at this, I'm talking about training trainers, teachers, coaches, and any different type of career path. And it doesn't have to be about sport. And I say that because of the refugee athletes, for example. They might want to study something else, but their platform that they have as an athlete to speak up about human rights or bringing peace to their countries, many of them have already been on an international stage. And so thinking about how you can integrate sports at a higher education level, whether it's to an athlete or to a refugee athlete or a refugee in a camp. So just to conclude on these points about working with multiple partners to implement programs, what InZone has learned, and some of the points that I've heard today, that I'd like some strategies that I would suggest, is first is to keep the refugee or the youth or whatever community that you're working in at the center, and to make sure that their voice is heard. The next is to have a common goal. Well, we have them. We have the SDGs, but whatever your program is. But the next one is to look at what assets you bring, as well as the other agencies bring. When we talk about higher education, there's nobody better placed than a university to bring higher education, and that is our job. But in the same with sports, these sports federations here, you are the best at doing sports. And bringing that into collaboration, whether it's with UNHCR and NGO, and each of you bringing those different pieces, but willing to learn from one another and to work together, and knowing that business might not be as usual. This has been a challenge for InZone at the university, challenging the mechanisms that the university has had in place in order to operate in a refugee context. So just being aware of that. So I'm happy to welcome feedback and to learn and to share and possibly work with some of the entities in this room or individuals. But I was also asked, in order to finish my presentation, it wasn't mentioned, but my husband, Alex Buis, is a professional sports photographer. Together with Gert Hendricks from AISTS, we're working on publishing a book about the refugee Olympic team that will be released late 2019, just in time for the 2020 Games. And I was asked to share it's a 1-minute slideshow that show some images to remind you of the joy and the opportunities of working in refugee context. And I know that many people in this room were working really hard to make sure that happens. So thank you for your work. But I also hope that this is a reminder and will encourage you to continue doing these programs in the future. So.
Thank you, panel. My name is Vikram, and I'm part of AISTS student group for this year, and I'm also working with Swiss Academy for Development. My question is regarding your data about UNHCR and refugees. You give numbers about composition of youth, like 51% are youth. But my question would be like, how much of those youth become employable in terms of when they get adult, and how much has sports contributed in them to transform those skills into a paying job and use those skills so that they can earn a living out of it? Thank you.
So the statistic that I gave you was actually 51% of refugees are children, so under 18. But indeed, we know that also a significant proportion are young people, so between 15 to 24. We're still working on getting those statistics, and hopefully this year for the first time we'll be able to publish statistics on young people as well. In terms of how sports can help people to gain the skills that give them hope and opportunities. So I think what Erin presented in terms of the opportunities in terms of connected learning for higher education, those are some opportunities there. The other thing that we're doing is we're working with Jesuit Worldwide Learning on, again, a connected learning program to help refugees become coaches and youth workers. The program is just starting, but indeed we hope that that will give them opportunities to become to become child and youth care workers, to become sports workers, to become community workers in refugee camps, but also in urban areas, and so that they have some opportunities. One of the challenges, of course, is that we have a lot of challenges in terms of refugees' right to work. And Erin spoke to you a little bit about some of the challenges that refugees have in accessing education. But hopefully with some of the global processes that are ongoing right now in terms of with the New York Declaration and the 2 global compacts on refugees and on migrants, states have made important commitments about access to education, about access to labor markets. And so we're quite hopeful that these processes, which we hope will result in 2 strong compacts in 2018, will also help young people's access to opportunities. Noting, of course, that many of those young people are in very uncertain circumstances right now, and that is one of the major concerns that young people raise with us, is what happens with their future. So hopefully things will change, but there are sort of activities and programs that are ongoing to help.
I have a very short question for Karen also regarding the word public-private partnership and also SDGs. You never mentioned those 2 words in your presentation, and is it because it's officially not something that the UNHCR is claiming to do, or is it just that it's not part of your ordinary vocabulary?
No, so as a lawyer who talks about international protection and human rights, indeed it is not often something that I talk about, but it is the way that I think we are increasingly working. And I think, again, the closer linkages between humanitarian and development actors, but also the need to look at broader solutions is forcing us to look at a broader range of partnerships. So looking at public-private partnerships. I can't even pronounce it. Clearly, it's not a word I use. But I do think that that's something very important to the way that we work. It's indeed something that UNHCR is increasingly sort of looking at as a change. But I do think it's the only way that we are going to be able to ensure that refugees are able to access their rights and that we change the perception of refugees globally. As you saw in that short video about the refugee Olympic athletes, these are people who aren't passive recipients of assistance. These are people who had lives just like you and I before they were forcibly displaced. They have a lot of capacities and strengths, and they can contribute a lot to the societies in which they are now, and certainly will contribute to their home countries when and if they are able to return. And that partnership between with private entities is a really important one. The other opportunity I think that I see is with, again, these global compacts and this whole of society approach that is recommended in the New York Declaration. It's a real opportunity for us, and I think also will prompt us to work a lot more strongly with through these public-private partnerships.
Thank you very much. So once again, I would like to thank you all for very stimulating and so provocative presentation. It was not easy to keep people excited at the end of the day, but I think you succeeded in doing so. So thank you again very much, and I will give back the floor to our MC. Thank you.
Makane, thank you too very much indeed, and to the panel. I'd like to ask the panelists if they would mind coming off the floor, off the panel, I beg your pardon, onto the floor. And I'd like to ask the facilitators from our 5 panels to join me back up here on the top table for just a few minutes, because we're going to make a brief effort to synthesize some of what we've been through in the course of today. So if I could ask Giovanni to come up, Margareta, and yes, thank you very much. All 5 of you, please. Emmanuel, where is Emmanuel? Here he comes.
Just pop it in.
And Claude. Okay, so it's it's going to take some digesting, all of this, and I think it's fair to say that you should be aware also that we've been streaming this. You can look back on the stream if you'd like to on our site, on the Métropole Imanique site, where all the documents have been posted in any case. There will also be a pulled-together report on the day and on the main thoughts, which will be added to that site. So please do look out for that. I'm sure we can prompt you as to when it's there as well. But let's close this by seeing where we've got over the course of 5 hours, some 50, 60,000 words of discussion and some debate. And I'm going to do it in the simplest order possible, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which gives Makane a moment actually to think about what his synthesis might actually be. So if we come back to the start of the day, hands up, panel 1. Claude. Perhaps you can give us, and do keep it brief, you know, we walk away with messages, not very many in our heads, so we don't need many, but we could have some clarity.
So just very quickly, so we listened to the AOC, and we understand that they have 3 spheres of influence, from the most controlled one, which is their own organization, to the Olympic movement, with influence, of course, and in the middle, the organizing committee of the Olympic Games. And 5 focus areas: infrastructure, resource, workforce, climate, resource, human resource, and mobility. And we had then the Mountaineering Association, where we understand that there are many initiatives. Obviously, mountains need to be protected. They have a mountain protection committee, and it's interesting. They are really proactive and having also award. We had the presentation from World Sailing. Sailing, obviously, also is very engaged in the environment, and interestingly, they have set up an independent committee with a survey to the member in order to advance or develop projects. We had also Taekwondo Federation, and Taekwondo is very active as well, in especially gender balance for the referee, for instance, to get to 50% with many initiatives. And as well with actually a foundation that is separated from the federation to conduct projects. And we had then FIFA, and FIFA is also much engaged. What I would just like to point out is the challenge to have bidding that is done many, many years before. So if you don't put in the contract what you would like in terms of standards, then you are a bit in more difficulty later on to make a change. And the conclusion was that you know, in this world of international federation, definitely the AOC play a key role in this journey on sustainability.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's move to the other side of the fence, if I could put it that way, Margrethe.
Okay, thank you. Panel 2 with the 4 key UN agencies came to a pretty unanimous conclusion, I think, although I haven't been able to check with them, but I'm sure they will agree, that it is a necessity to strive for attaining the SDGs. That it is also a fact that all kinds of projects and programs had already been in place and have only been reinforced by the Kazan Action Plan and will carry on existing. What lessons are drawn from that were, according to the way I felt it, each UN agency has, of course, its own objectives. This means, of course, that there is a need to coordinate, but that need is maybe not sufficiently met at this stage. There may be conflicts, actually. Conflicts, whether or not we can avoid them, that is another question. There is a certain
maybe a frustration, or maybe a wish, or maybe a longing for better coordination, for working together within the UN agencies, working together with outside partners of the sports world, and working together with people in the field, also governments and so on. For that to succeed, it was regretted by some, at least, so as far as we could hear, that there's no unique UN agency left to do that work, help do that work, if it needs to be done by one agency. I can also see that there is measurements, there are evaluations are in place, but it looks like maybe the actors themselves don't consider it well enough done so far, or sufficiently exploited. And also there's not enough knowledge about what evaluations are around, like at the WHO, which could be combined with something with UNEP or UNESCO or UNICEF. So I think the outcome I would call, and once again I didn't have a chance to really talk with panelists about it, but the outcome is that probably at least more dialogue will be needed, more communication amongst agencies, what they do and how they could set up things together, how they could improve things, because the idea should be, and that was actually the theme of today, and maybe we didn't talk enough about it, how can we enhance the efficiency of what is being done, because a lot is being done. So I think that was the outcome, and the message is, let's carry on doing it better and better together. Yes?
Margaret, thank you very much indeed. Emmanuel, you were looking at institutions, NGOs working within sport and using sport to reach the SDGs.
Yes, thank you, David. I tried to surf with 4 challenges that Jill Klein from World Sport Alliance present at the end of our panel 3. So one first challenge is the coordination of of existing multi-stakeholder initiatives than increase their number. The second challenge is more the organization of synergies in fundraising between governments, businesses, financial institutions, NGOs, leading to creation of tools. Third challenge is more, there is clearly a big need for impact evaluation of sustainable development projects through sport. And here maybe academic and best innovation or best tool could be shared also by all the expert institutions in this domain. And the last challenge is coordinating, financing and evaluating inevitably raise the issue of SDGs governance.
Emmanuel, thank you very much indeed. Giovanni, over to you.
Thank you to Gilles.
Your assault on coordination, but a few other things as well.
No, actually, I think he missed the fact that Gilles also said something very precisely on coordination. He said perhaps we should establish a world board of all these platforms together so we would know how to better dialogue and so on. I think the point is very well taken and shouldn't be missed. As far as the panel I was involved, I had the privilege to facilitate. We focused on legacy and sustainability. Sustainability is more about convergence, while legacy is looking beyond what is going to happen over a period of time, particularly when it comes to mega sporting events. Now, this is something to do both with coordination, to my views and to the views of the panelists. We didn't focus much on coordination, contrary to some of our stakeholders around here, but on policy coherence. First of all, because it's achievable, and second, because SDG is about policy coherence, leading to the fact that we have measurement established in the SDGs, and most of all, they are established at the level of the country. So we have to make sure that our capacity building is raised to the fact that people should know better how to use national strategy, which are linked to SDGs, and therefore to link to what the countries are doing, because they select the priorities and they also work on measurement from their perspective. Now, that being said, we are not against the others taking the lead in measuring whatever they want to measure. One issue is that WHO has called for collaboration and contribution, and I think that's a good example. The other call was, and I am happy to see that even HCR is now interested in access to labor market for those who are sport-related or somehow enhanced through sport, finally. Finally, employability through and in sport is fully recognized, even by our competition agency within the system. And there was a call by UN, by ENGSO particularly, and the international scholar sport federations to actually work on two things. First of all, they have invested time and energy in employability studies, and that is something we should support, at least from ILO perspective, it goes without saying. The other issue is we are talking about athletes accessing the labor market. So we are talking about skills that are adherent to sport, but basically serve other purposes. And therefore, this is what we are looking forward to work with, and we call for others to join us. And we mentioned the fact that this is in the action plan of Kazan. So we are not inventing something new, but actually we are investing into 3 policy areas. One from the IOC, in the IOC Sustainability Strategy. Second, in the Kazan Action Plan. Third, in the Erasmus Plus program, which is, by the way, includes a lot of resources. Did I miss anything? Maybe Perfect. Not. And we were gender balanced, just to make sure that that Lila is happy with it. And then the other issue is biodiversity is about risk management, assessing risks, and therefore engaging in dialogue as early as possible with the stakeholders. And I think that the best practice from Giulia, IUCN, is something that we should value and perhaps bring forward in the discussion with the IOC and other federations. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. You lose 1 point, penalty point, for boasting about gender equality more than once in an afternoon. Makane, you've had a few minutes to collect your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, David. I think I would identify four lessons. Lesson number one, in my view, I think that some of the presentations we had in panel 5 show that we should not be that obsessed for formalized partnerships. That, you know, informal partnerships can also work very well in the system. And sometimes we have that obsession that everything has to be formalized and has to be put in a clear box, clear category. But what the different experiences that our panelists have shared with us show that both formalized and informal practices or partnerships can work very well in this field. Lesson number 2, I think the need for a comprehensive engagement. We should not turn this sports and sustainable development goals discussion or dialogue between only sports organizations and international institutions, interstate organizations. The complexity of the issue shows that we need more. We need academic institutions, we need other NGOs maybe that are usually involved in human rights issues or humanitarian issues. So I think we need to think about having a very, very comprehensive engagement and partnership if we really want to have results there. Then the third lesson that, you know, some of our colleagues have already touched upon, capacity building. But for me, capacity building is not only with respect to how to build partnerships in the field of sport. Capacity building on what is SDGs. You know, right now in Africa, we are negotiating a continental free trade agreement. It's supposed to be a mega regional for the entire African continent that is supposed to liberalize the markets and, how do we say that, increase the flow of foreign investment in Africa. And, you know, whenever some of us try to put on the table SDGs, we have problems. We have problems because many of the negotiators think that SDGs are actually an hurdle. hurdle, sorry, to economic development. The only thing they like in the SDGs is the idea of poverty eradication, but these days think they can get it somewhere else than using SDGs. So SDGs in an economic agreement is a problem. And I think if we want people also to be more aware of all these linkages, we really need to invest in capacity building in many, many parts of the world. And this brings me to a last lesson I think is important, is awareness. We need to put sports, as I was saying, even as a professor of international law that has been doing for 20 years sustainable development, I've never realized that sports were there. And I think that those who negotiated the Rio Declaration and so on didn't realize. So we need awareness. We need to make sure that in education programs at primary school level, secondary school level, university levels, that people are really aware of sport as a centerpiece in all this debate. But if you allow me just to finish on one point, it's not a lesson, but you know, I want to be a bit more optimistic, because sometimes I was hearing a lot of colleagues in the room being a bit skeptical about the lack of coordination, lack of coherence, but this is common to the international system. We need to be a bit more nuanced. What I see in the sports governance is not the worst. It's not the worst. And, we've been talking a lot in our circles about the fragmentation of the system, lack of coordination. So it's not something that is peculiar to the sports governance. I think that the sports governance actually, for what I've seen, is doing quite good. And what we need maybe to do is to build from what we have, strengthen that, and also try to identify best practices in other fields and how we can, get inspiration from that to move on. So I wanted to finish on that optimistic note. Thank you. Which is a very good one to come from a broader perspective. Makane, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all of you for pulling together so succinctly some of the main issues there. I just very briefly, as you know, representative of the BBC, we spend our life saying on the one hand, on the other, so that we keep right down the middle. On the one hand, we have heard lots of stories of achievement, I think, and success, which are critically important, balanced out beautifully, I think, by a recognition of obstacles and some huge frustrations. And in a sense, that they seem to be the proof points that an occasion like this is extremely important in terms of recognizing where the challenges are and maintaining the dialogue. So I hope that this is something you all feel has been very useful. Your engagement in terms of questions has made my life and the facilitator's life much easier, so thank you for all of those as well. And that brings us to the close of this seminar. Just as a reminder, look out on the site for a completed document, a pulling together of what we've had in the course of today, and for the streaming if you want to pick that up again. But once again, to all of you, and indeed our facilitators, thank you very much.